Friday, March 27th, 2026. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Grant Hermes. Before we get rolling today, I want to apologize for the little hiatus I was on the last couple weeks or so. Just a little over a week, I guess it was. If you're a subscriber to the Make It Make Sense Substack, you still got the regular articles. You just didn't get the podcast episodes. Things have been piling up here in the admin side, the business side of Make It Make Sense that I had to take care of, and there was some life things that got in the way as well that I also very much needed to take care of. So hopefully you were understanding of that, but I promise as we head into primary season here, I will be back in full force because there is going to be a lot of news happening. That gets us to today's conversation, where we've been watching for the past 6 weeks or so another government shutdown, a partial one, albeit, over the Department of Homeland Security. And Congress's seeming inability to get anything really done. And a lot of what the Senate and the House, specifically because they're controlled by Republicans right now, have been doing is giving up a lot of power to the president. It's something that I have talked about over and over again here on the show, but I've also written quite a bit about on the Substack and at Things You Forgot from Civics class. It's why when I saw that the Bipartisan Policy Center had a brand new series of articles out called Congress at a Crossroads, all about how Congress needs to make a choice about what happens next before it starts to really crumble beneath its own feet, I jumped at the chance to talk to the Director of Structural Democracy over at the Bipartisan Policy Center, Michael Thorning. He and I talk all about what's wrong with Congress right now, how we got to where it is, and how we can fix it. And part of that falls on us as voters. It's a really interesting conversation, and I think maybe one of the most important conversations that nobody is having right now. Before we get to that, make sure you are following or subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. Become a subscriber to the Make It Make Sense Substack, where I've got a brand new article coming out tomorrow because I did miss that one earlier this week because I was traveling, and you can imagine what that was like. And as always, share the show on social media. It's Mims News Pod. It's MIMS News Pod, all one word on every platform. I am at Grant Hermes on Twitter and Bluesky, and at Grant_Hermes on everything else. All right, let's get to my conversation with Michael Thorning. Real quick, warmer weather is just around the corner. Maybe you've got those spring break plans with the family, or maybe you've already got summer on the mind, but either way, you definitely don't want to get caught in last year's sunglasses. Akila is an independent eyewear brand out of Los Angeles, and they make handcrafted sunglasses that actually look good without the ridiculous designer markup. We're talking plant-based materials, recycled lenses, sustainable packaging. They even donate 1% of all sales to environmental nonprofits, and Make It Make Sense gets a cut too. So you know you look good and you're doing some good too. The frames all look great, they're reasonably priced, and you can get them in UV blockers, blue light blockers, and even prescription lenses. Right now, you can use the code MIMS25 at AKILA.la for 10% off your entire order. That is the best discount offer they have, and you're not going to find a better deal anywhere else. Just head to AKILA.la, that's IKILA.la, and use the code MIMS25 at checkout. The link for that is in the show notes. All right, let's get on with the show. Michael, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. I'm a big fan of your work over at the Bipartisan Policy Center, so this is a true joy to have you on.
Well, thanks for having me, Grant.
So I want to start here with maybe the hardest, but also maybe easiest question. I haven't decided as I've been thinking about this interview. What's wrong with Congress? What's the problem over there?
Yeah, that seems like a question a lot of people are asking these days. And, there's no one simple answer. I wish there was. But let me try to give you a few things that are going on. One is just the political environment that Congress operates within. Members of Congress respond to the political pressures in our system. And that's a good thing. We want that. We want that responsiveness. But the challenge is that members are getting very different signals from, different aspects of the electorate. We have a pretty evenly divided country politically, certainly on partisanship. And so, there's not a clear signal, as there has been through a lot of our history, about what direction voters want the people in Congress to go. We're actually living in a pretty unusual moment in our history where The parties are pretty equally competitive, or they're kind of electorally at parity, we might call it. Either party could really win the next election, and so that says something about the voters being relatively split. And so Congress isn't getting clear signals from voters. It's actually, I should say, it's not just about a lack of clarity, it's about conflicting signals from voters. And so, no surprise, Congress is a reflection of the country and the electorate. And so we get, a Congress that's just as divided as we are. And then people throw their hands up and say, well, I don't understand. One perspective I often have on that is like, well, these are the people you sent. This is the
Right.
American people. This is the Congress. They asked for, maybe not at the individual level, but on a collective level. So that's one big part of the problem.
Right.
Is the political environment.
It is that thing where it's Congress has a 16% approval rating. Like I think it ranks just below syphilis or something like that, right? That's the poll. But at the same time, if you're an incumbent in Congress, you get reelected. It's up in the 90s, 95% of the time. So it's this push me pull you thing here. But what do you mean when you say that Congress itself is getting conflicting messages from the American people? It seems pretty resounding that people don't like Congress. Or is it that they don't like Congress as a whole, but they might like their individual member of Congress or their individual senator?
Yeah. So again, there's a few answers here. I mean, one, it tends to be views are based on party, and so they may look at their member of Congress and they may match up with their partisanship, and so that's the most clear signal most people have about an elected official, whether they like them or not, is are they simply a member of my party, and they may not know enough about them otherwise to really make a judgment. But that kind of gets at one of the challenges here, which is that the country, has really geographically sorted along political lines a lot more in recent years. And so, people tend to live in communities where people have views that are like them. We haven't quite gotten to the bottom of why that is yet. We don't know if people move to those communities because they match with their views, or if they adapt their views to the community that they're living in. There's still some debate about that.
Mhm.
But what that means is that you've got pretty solid conservative pockets of the country, pretty solid liberal pockets, and those sort of purple areas everyone thinks about have grown increasingly rare. And so you're actually just we're not sending members who are responding to those purple areas. We're sending a lot of members who are responding to red or blue areas to Congress, and there's really no incentive there for them to compromise, except when that really smaller and smaller sliver in the middle is able to pull people in, or when something's an emergency and Congress just has to do something. So when I say they're getting conflicting signals, they're not getting it from their own constituents. Constituents are sending people that match up with their views. It's just that they happen to pretty equally be mismatched with the views of the other members who are getting sent to Washington.
Sure. All of that has sort of made for this true gridlock in Congress. I mean, I think you and I are thinking specifically about the House, but even just this morning, yes, the Senate did pass a bill to open up DHS again, but that took weeks. I mean, we were talking more than a month, almost 6 weeks of that. So the Senate isn't immune from this either. This new series that you're doing is Congress at a Crossroads. Why is this time more dire, do you think, than another time in congressional history?
Yeah, and what I should say is Congress has been at a crossroads before. This is definitely not the first time. And Congress, as an institution, tends to work through these cycles of, being very influential in American politics, and that can sort of ebb and flow. It goes through these periods of high and low power in politics, and so that's not unusual in our history. But I think we are clearly at another one of those crossroads. And maybe it's helpful to step back and give a little bit of a deeper explanation of what we mean by being at a crossroads. For us, you and I have talked about the political system legitimacy and trust in Congress among the voters, and that's really important. The other thing, though, in our system is Congress's ability to position itself as one of our three branches of government.
Mm-hmm.
Founders set up three branches that would both conflict and cooperate. It was never meant to be just one or the other, but the founders had this idea that ambition would counter ambition among the different branches, and so that Congress as an institution would never allow the president to become too powerful, vice versa. The Supreme Court and the judiciary being added in there as well. They would all kind of work as a check on each other. About 20 years ago, some scholars started to identify something that they referred to as separation of parties rather than separation of powers. And what that really meant was that rather than the branches of government having what we might call institutional patriotism. So if you're in Congress, you defend Congress's powers and rights no matter what party you're in. That institutional patriotism was replaced with partisanship. And so people in Congress are laser focused right now on doing whatever they need to do to deliver on the party's agenda. And what that often has meant over the last 30 to 40 years is sacrificing the institution's influence, authority, ability to shape the debate, because what the parties have decided is that winning the presidency is the most important thing. And if they win the presidency, the president can take all this unilateral action and achieve their agenda without having to go through the normal legislative process. And so you as a consequence of that, start to whittle away just the influence and purpose of Congress, within our system of government, which is really crucial. I'm of the view that it is the most crucial of the branches because it's the most representative. And so when we say Congress is at a crossroads, we actually less are concerned about the legitimacy among the public. Congress has been unpopular throughout our history. You can go back 100 years, 200 years, and find members complaining about how, they even before polling, they were being compared to some of the worst aspects of society. They were, always the butt of jokes and consternation, and so that's not new. But what we really are worried about is Congress's ability to carry out its duties, vis-a-vis the executive and the judiciary, and we think they're at a particularly low ebb in that.
Yeah, I think this idea is interesting that Congress has been unpopular kind of the entire time it's been around. I think that's more a product that people just don't like conflict, and that's all that Congress is. The legislative branch is all about conflict and compromise, and people don't like, how the sausage is made. And I think that gets in the way of a lot of how people feel. There are two things that you talked about here that I want to unpack a little bit. And the first one is this idea of supplanting the party for the institution, and that there was this old adage in politics that all politics is local. And that is, at least in my lifetime, has certainly felt more and more untrue. And that now we are in a position in which all politics is national. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about here that is getting in the way of Congress's original duty? Because I agree with you, and I think the founders would certainly agree too, that the legislative branch actually isn't co-equal, that it's actually a little bit more powerful, line by line in the Constitution, and certainly in the rest of the laws that they've written, that the legislature is supposed to have just a little bit more power than the president, than the Supreme Court, because it's the representative body directly to the people every 2 years in that way if you're in the House. So is it the problem that we've moved away from focusing on local politics in that same way, or is this not the exact right way to look at this?
No, I think that's right. Let me give you the maybe kind of longer theory of the case here.
Yeah.
But I start off with just saying, I think the phrase some people use, I use, right? Congress is the first among equals in the branches. But, the founders recognize this. Alexander Hamilton wrote in the Federalist Papers, right, that, in this system, the legislature necessarily predominates.
Yeah.
And I think we're probably about as far away from that as we possibly could be in terms of the way Congress actually behaves. But what we think is going on here is kind of a confluence of events, and I've already touched on some of these things. You're totally right. Nationalization is one of the biggest trends, happening in our politics. And I knew something like this was happening maybe 8 or 10 years ago. I remember seeing a state secretary of state race where the candidate was talking about something that the president was doing. It had nothing to do with any duty of the secretary of state in that state. And so I just couldn't wrap my head around that at first. But essentially, for a lot of reasons, people's focus on politics has become what happens at the national level, what happens to the party's agenda. And we find, that, the parties actually are quite united in terms of advancing, their goals at the local, state, and federal level. But those things have just become so much more unified over time that you find, at all these levels, the party is rowing in the same direction wherever it's in power.
Right.
But nationalization is just one part of it. And I touched on partisanship and polarization before. That's one part of it. And I even got into a little bit of the history of, how this is an unusual thing for us. We actually tend to go through these longer periods of one party dominance, which incentivizes a party that thinks it's going to be in the minority for an extended period of time to negotiate and try to get things from the majority, recognizing that they're not going to be in power anytime soon. We had a long period, basically from the Great Depression up to the 1990s, where Democrats, basically controlled Congress. That entire period, with a few exceptions in between. And so the White House was the only thing in contention. But even then, Republican presidents knew they were going to have to deal with a Democratic Congress to get done the things they wanted to get done. Yeah. We're in a different world right now. Where we are now is the parties know they're highly competitive. Either party could win the White House in any given election. Either party could win the House or Senate in any given election. And that also trickles down to the state levels, although the states are a little bit more politically homogenous internally. So you've got red and blue states. But on a national level, the parties are highly competitive, which is not necessarily a bad thing, except that it doesn't incentivize cooperation. It doesn't incentivize negotiation. What that incentivizes is just maximally pursuing whatever it is you are trying to accomplish. And worse, trying to stop the other side from getting whatever it is that they are after in our political system. Right. And so that's where you get the gridlock. And so there's, sort of this theory. Okay, we have these unstable majorities. Francis Lee, who's a scholar at Princeton, kind of identified this, we're living in one of these weird periods where the parties are really fighting for dominance. And one of them is hoping to come out on top, right? They hope we're about to be in a period of either long-term Democratic rule or long-term Republican rule. And that is what their ultimate aim is. And so you have a system where Congress is much harder to get things done than the executive. The executive can do a lot on its own unilaterally. And certainly the last 5 presidents have sought to expand that even more, pushing the boundaries. That's all in service of this same cause. Congress, when you have a unified government like we do right now, or like we did at the beginning of the Biden administration, the beginning of the first Trump administration, the beginning of the Obama administration, they're not going to do very much to undermine their own president. Why? Because the president, in their view, is the key to getting their agenda accomplished in Washington.
Sure.
They know the legislative process is hard. They know whatever they can get done legislatively is going to be really tough and by luck, and they're going to have to come up with all kinds of schemes for how to do it. So they would rather defer to the president. They would rather say, okay, we want this policy on immigration, and so we're not going to try to pass an immigration law. The president's got all kinds of authority, and if they even expand beyond the authority they've got, we're not going to challenge them.
Right. Right.
And so you get this sort of feedback loop where it encourages a president's party to be deferential to them. And so presidentialism expands because the parties are prioritizing their electoral prospects above their own institutional standing and prerogatives.
I think that's the hardest thing for me lately to get my head around. And yes, this has been happening since Obama, really, right? This idea of massive executive creep in this way. I think we have seen it grow exponentially under certainly Trump's first term, but definitely in the last, year and change here as Trump 2.0 has moved to expand those things really rapidly, and that Congress hasn't stood in the way at all. And the thing that I have trouble wrapping my head around is it's kind of like the legislative branch cutting its nose off to spite its face in a way, where yes, it's this deference to the movement of the party and what the party wants and their eventual aims to set them up for, they're behaving in this moment like the Republicans will never not have power. And I think you're getting mixed messages from some people. I think John Thune in the Senate is very clearly like, that's not going to be a forever thing. We shouldn't, let's say, blow up the filibuster for the SAVE Act or whatever. But it is this thing where on the other side of this, it's a much weaker branch of the government. And how do you circle that square about the long-term effects of what Congress now is doing to itself?
Yeah, I mean, the long-term effects we've actually seen for a while. There's a great scholar at the University of Virginia, Sidney Milkis. He has a new book out with another political scientist, Nick Jacobs. And they have written about, this actually goes back further than we think. This actually may predate the Great Depression. A lot of people think FDR is sort of, the New Deal is kind of where this presidentialism really started. They actually go a little bit further back to Woodrow Wilson. So we're maybe dealing with like a 100-year trend here, but it's only just recently really intensified.
Mm-hmm.
And what is unique about now is that it is aligned with this moment of polarization, and that did not exist throughout that those earlier periods.
Right.
And so, the challenge for Congress here is, how do you change the way you think about your job, right? Members think about their job as representing their constituents, who, for the most part, most districts, again, pretty party aligned, so they think they're doing what their constituents want. You vote your district, you vote your party, and you vote your conscience. And so, for a lot of them, the only one that might be in conflict with the first two might be the last one. And very many of them, and I don't know that that's a bad principle for a legislator, but they think of themselves as doing the right thing because they're putting their personal judgment aside in order to vote their constituents' judgment and their party. The other aspect of this is just how power was delegated over the last 50 to 70 years. When we lived in a very different era, the parties were much more mixed. Even post-Watergate, I think there was a lot of assumption that these concepts of institutional patriotism would hold up, and that bipartisanship would sort of continue to be the coin of the realm. And unfortunately, all of these I'm going to name a few of them. So these power structures were designed right at the end of that period, and right as we were entering this other, much more conflictual moment in our politics, and much more partisan. And so, we saw Congress handing over power to the executive, around trade, around national emergencies. War powers is a bit of a special case because presidents have sort of always been pushing on that.
Right.
There was a lot on spending, that where Congress, after Watergate, said, we're going to set up a process. And if the president, wants to change what we have decided the spending should be, they've got to submit it to us and we've got to reapprove it. And so the structure of power right now really puts Congress at the disadvantage. And I'll explain why, which is that most of these frameworks are set up so that the president can act in some way they want to. Right. Let's say they want to raise tariffs, and they've declared a national emergency that allows them to do that, if that's their theory. It's obviously currently being debated in the courts, but the burden, the way it's set up, is on Congress to stop or overturn that national emergency. That's really hard to do right now. And it's not just because people say, oh, the problem's the Senate, the filibuster, 60 votes. That's not the only problem, because the problem is Congress can't act unilaterally to stop these things, right? The Constitution requires Congress to pass a law and the president to sign a law. And so really you're talking about a potential 67 vote threshold in the Senate, because you've got to be able to override a veto.
Right.
If you're trying to stop the action of a president, it's very unlikely that just because Congress passes a law, they're going to stop behaving the way they have been. So,
right.
That is part of why it's harder for Congress, to intervene when they think the executive has gone too far. It's just the way in statute. This isn't a constitutional problem. The way the statutes have been designed is really mismatched with how Congress can deploy its power and influence in the system. So one way to do that differently would be to say, the president can declare a national emergency, but the emergency automatically expires unless Congress approves of it continuing, after a certain number of days, right? That's one way to do that. So there's power structure problems. The other thing we often point to, that Congress has become really weakened because, and this is a little bit more on the political side, it's become politically expedient to add to the beating up on Washington and the beating up on Congress. There's this idea of, you run for Congress by running against Congress.
Yeah.
One of the ways that manifests when you get there is you start making all these commitments to, we're going to cut our own budgets, and, we've got to set the example in the government. What's happened is the Congress has basically flatlined in terms of funding and resources, since like the aughts, the early 2000s, really has not significantly changed. Meanwhile, the executive branch of the government has grown astronomically, and we can't figure out, why can't Congress conduct sufficient oversight? Why can't, Congress go toe to toe with the Department of Justice and its thousands of lawyers? Congress has just bought into the politics of beating up on itself and not investing in itself. And so it often doesn't have the capacity it needs now to even if they wanted to try to challenge the executive on some of these things, they're at a real internal disadvantage.
It's sort of Stockholm syndrome itself. It is both the hostage and the hostage taker in that situation, which is like just an insane position for this branch of government to be in. So how do we get out of this? I mean, is it things where you've got laws like AKILA, like the tariff law, or even the War Powers Act, right? That gives the president, I'm pretty sure it's 60 full days. Technically it's 30 days plus a 30-day drawback, so it's 60 days. Do you change those laws to make those triggers shorter? How do you give the legislature maybe the permission from us, the voters, or permission from itself to take back some of this power? How does Congress get its groove back, I guess is what I'm asking here.
Yeah. I think Congress has to do a few things. I think one, Congress has got to start demonstrating to the public that it can still get stuff done. I think right now the public is generally happy with the arrangement that exists because they see presidents as much more decisive, much more action-oriented. We also live in a political culture that sort of reveres the presidency, and there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, right? I mean, the president is thought of as the leader of the free world. I mean, that's not nothing,
right?
But admiration, for country's, sort of executive leader isn't new, right? This goes back to ancient history. No one really knows, with the exception of maybe some people who assassinated Caesar, like who were the Roman, senators.
Right. Right.
But you could probably name, at least one or two emperors, dictators, et cetera. So Congress has got to do some stuff to build back its own reputation, I think, with the public. Because you're right. I mentioned obviously that it's always been unpopular, but I think, it's just sort of slipped and slipped. It's not, not clear we've reached the bottom.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. And I think that comes through not necessarily acting on these issues we've talked about, right? That comes through the everyday legislative action that the public wants to see, right? The public is highly concerned about costs right now. And can Congress do something like get a housing bill passed that can ease some of that?
Mm-hmm.
They're certainly trying, but they're not there yet. You look at, the situation, with the shutdown at the Department of Homeland Security because Congress hasn't been able to agree on how to fund them, and their experience with government every day, if they're showing up to the airport, is, wow, look at these lines. And even if
Right.
they're not showing up to the airport, they're seeing it on the news every day. Look
Right.
at these lines. Wow, how is this happening? And I don't know that all falls to Congress necessarily in the public's mind, but I think they know Congress is partly at
Right.
fault.
Right. Right. I have a
Um,
question about that there, because when you think about the Biden administration, right, quite a few bills get through in the first half of the Biden administration. The American Rescue Plan gets passed. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Plan gets passed. Massive bills that, in this framework that we're talking about here, should have told the public that Congress can work for you, but that didn't land.
Yeah.
And so does Congress have a marketing problem? Is that what we're talking about here?
Well, I don't know if it was a marketing problem, and I'll try not to read the tea leaves too much on it.
Sure.
What I'd say is I think the confluence of events, whatever the causes were, I won't try to to pick through that or investigate the causes, but I think the timing of events, um, you know, that was totally overcome by the economic situation. Whether those were good bills or not, whether they contributed to it or not, the public, is not likely to sit there and go like, well, inflation is 10, 11%, but yeah, they did get that infrastructure bill done. So I guess we shouldn't be too upset about it. Right? So
Right.
whichever side of the story you buy, if this was supply chain hangover from the pandemic, this was Biden administration and Democratic overspending, maybe a little bit of both. If you, in that moment, the number one thing on voters' minds, and that carried through all the way to 2024, was, inflation and costs are too high. And so Congress was really in no convincing position to say, well, we're doing all this good stuff for you.
Right.
Because I think the public was sort of looking around thinking like, where is it?
Right.
So I don't think it's a marketing problem in that sense. I don't think that's something marketing can overcome. I think the other part, and there's a little bit of a role for this in Congress, with the Biden administration. I think it revealed, I don't think this was specific to the Biden administration, but on the executive branch even side, our government has gotten very atrophied at carrying out public policy. And we have implementation challenges and problems. And so I think if you look at, the Inflation Reduction Act, which had a lot of this clean energy infrastructure rollout that might have been good for the economy. And certainly now, as we're looking at energy prices, highly volatile, maybe we're wishing we had a little bit more of this renewable energy in the mix. But in any event, I think a lot of people looked around and were very convinced by this argument that, well, you were supposed to build all these electric car charging stations, and they built, I don't know what it was some paltry number of the ones.
It was supposed to be in the tens of thousands, and it was in like the hundreds, maybe. Yeah. I don't think it was more than 500 even. Yeah.
Yeah. Like that registers for Americans of like, wait a minute, we spent a lot of taxpayer money on this, and like, what did we get? I think that spoke to an inability of the government to carry out policy really well. And there are a lot of people working on that. It's a very different cause than my own, which is much more focused on Congress. But you do have to ask some questions. Congress's job should be there to do oversight of that. Yeah. Why wasn't Congress sort of following the money, following these projects, beating the drum? I think honestly, a lot of Democrats in Congress didn't want to be seen beating up on their own president, especially going into an election where they weren't really sure he was going to be, super competitive.
Right.
And so, the incentive was misaligned there to hold the people carrying out the law to account. And that's on Congress, right? Like they made a decision to care more about party than they did about, policy, and the public, punished them for that, I think. Eventually. Right. So, some of it is that, Congress really does have to do the job it's supposed to do. I think there's a belief that, people in Congress have come to see that like sort of like whatever we do, people are going to be upset, so it doesn't matter. And I think which they don't see as like carte blanche to just go do whatever, but it encourages them actually, I think, to take less and less ambitious action.
Sure.
When in reality, at least in my view, they should be thinking people are going to be mad at us no matter what, so we really need to try our damnedest hard to make sure that people aren't mad at us.
Right.
That they're getting something out of government that is better than what they were getting before.
So then how do we get to a place like that? How do we get to a place in which they feel like they're emboldened to behave that way, in which the structures of this really entrenched, party over institution mentality gets in the way of this? How do we move beyond those things?
Yeah. I don't know how movable that is. And I think that's something that needs a lot of consideration as we think about how to redesign some of the ways power is structured in the system. Like I said, post Watergate, the assumption was, well, people are going to defend the institution over their party because Republicans crossed the line and party lines and were willing to threaten to impeach their own president. We're obviously not living in that moment. And so I don't know that there are a lot of levers you can pull to change, this is this big unwieldy thing that is just politics, right? And there isn't some thing you can do that is just going to make people, less partisan, less want their party to be in power. And so I think what you have to do is change the structure of the power so that it favors more the legislative branch than the executive branch. And, so like this instance with national emergencies, and, I kind of gave before of like, well, if you actually put the burden on Congress to keep it, going, the president can declare it, can take action maybe for so many days, and then Congress actually has to keep approving it. That switches right where the power is located. The president can start this thing, but it's up to Congress to actually confront the challenge instead of passing the buck,
Right.
which is usually what happens. And so I do think that will be meaningfully different in terms of how partisans are willing to behave. Like in an instance of a war powers situation, I think members will be thinking twice. Much more about their power and how to use it if it's ultimately up to them whether or not the conflict continues, versus whether they can kind of let things just keep going. If they don't take any action, then the status quo remains the same.
Right.
If they know this change in status quo is actually on them and that they're going to be held to account for it and they're going to be held responsible for it, I think that's a lot better way for us to divide power, because, let's say something goes terribly wrong. Well, people are going to blame Congress, in that situation. And you better believe that the president's going to be out there, whoever they are, defending, themselves and blaming Congress for not, following their lead and continuing to support them. And so I think what we've got to do is just create more situations where Congress is forced to be in the driver's seat on decision making, rather than being in the back seat and kind of being able to pick and choose where it wants to insert itself.
It strikes me here that this idea might be good not just for Congress, but for the entire government as a whole, for the entire democratic experiment here in America, that maybe a rising tide lifts all boats in this way. Is that is there a knock-on effect of letting Congress back in the driver's seat here?
I think so, because, for one, I think on the other side, of Pennsylvania Avenue, you're going to have an administration that realizes that they actually have to deal with Congress, right? They're going to have to go and try to convince some people and negotiate with them, and maybe people not in their own party. And so, that changes how an administration is going to behave, I think, across the board, right? Right now, if you're the president, you have unified party government, you kind of feel like you can do what you want to the other party and to a lot of members of your own party, and you're going to get away with it. But if the power dynamic is a little bit more evened out, like we're talking, you know, you start to realize that like actually every decision you make, every action you take could have some downstream effect when, you know, you need somebody's vote later, or you need somebody's support later, for your priorities to continue. So I do think there's potential for that knock-on effect. I think it's also just on the legal side, clearly where the Supreme Court is trying to push things. You know, they've had a number of rulings in recent both months, but actually over like the last couple of decades, where the court is really clearly trying to signal that this era of, you know, presidentialism and the president, you know, creating powers and laws that don't really exist for them, like that's just not going to fly anymore. And the court really wants to see Congress much more actively a part of making governing decisions as it should be. And so eventually, I think on the legal side, you know, administration could start to run out of the running room that they've had.
Right. And the last thing I want to ask here too, and it's kind of a thing that I always like to end these things with, and it's what's the call to action then for voters? Because in this whole conversation, we've been talking for almost 40 minutes here, we haven't quite talked about the role of the voter in this. What's our responsibility as citizens, as voters, as people who send people to Congress?
Yeah.
What's on us to demand of them to make these changes? Because like you said at the very beginning of this, members of Congress, despite how we feel about how cracked and packed people are, how polarized things are, they're still fairly responsive to their own voters, or at least they can be. And so what's our role in all of this?
I think it's pretty rare that members of Congress hear from their voters about these things. And I get that. You know, most voters are worried about, you know, how they're, you know, going to put food on the family's table, how, you know, what is the status of their job, you know, what is the cost of gas, all these things, that, you know, what's the quality of education in their community, what's their ability to pay for and get good health care. And I think, you know, that is what they tend to hear from voters about. And those are important and totally understandable. I, you know, used to work on Capitol Hill. I talked to a lot of constituents about those issues. But I think members of Congress are under the impression that the public just doesn't really care about these kinds of separation of powers, checks and balances issues. You know, that it's just like a little bit too abstract and, you know, it's all, you know, inside baseball, inside the beltway. But I think what people are realizing, I think, especially during, you know, first Trump administration, the Biden administration, and now the second Trump administration, that what power the president has to act unilaterally is really important. So if you are one of the people who is upset and you think that tariffs are driving costs up, you need to realize that the president has been given the power to do that by Congress. You need to tell your member of Congress, I don't want the system to work that way anymore. You're supposed to be, you know, representing me in government and setting that kind of thing. If you were upset about, you know, the Biden administration trying to cancel student loan debt, about, you know, vaccine mandates, about, you know, any number of things they did during the pandemic that you thought impinged on your liberty, then you care about this. You care about what Congress's standing is, you know, vis-a-vis the executive. You want a Congress that can stand up to a runaway president. But right now we don't have that. And so if you care about immigration policy and you think, you know, the administration, either the Biden administration wasn't doing enough or wasn't doing anything, or you think the Trump administration has gone too far, you know, again, the answer to that is Congress. And it's not just calling your member and, you know, saying, hey, I want you to support this policy, support this outcome. What people need to start doing is making clear that they want Congress to do something about changing the way power is structured and the system works, so that we get a less volatile politics, right? We have I would say for the last, you know, 25 years, we've had really volatile politics because Congress has not been there to play the mediating role that it's supposed to in our system, right? You know, it's really hard for one person. I'll give a president, the presidency, a little bit of a break here. like it's really hard. John Dickerson, longtime CBS reporter, has a book calling it the hardest job in the world.
It's back here somewhere. It's
there you go.
On my head. Yeah.
I've got a commemorative pencil here somewhere on my desk, and I think that's right. And presidents, of course, convince themselves that they can do it.
Yeah,
you couldn't get to that job if you couldn't convince yourself of it. But there's really an impossibility to the idea that one person could somehow channel all the diverse views and interests of a huge nation, and that is why. I mean, that was the beauty. We're coming up on at least 250 years of independence. We're not at 250 years of the Constitution yet, but the whole idea that the framers of the Constitution had was that you can have a republic like ours that's spread out, it's geographically diverse and large, it's got different viewpoints, it can accommodate different religious views and different morals and different economies, but you needed some kind of place for differences and conflicts to be negotiated and figured out, and that's what Congress is supposed to do. It'd sort of be like, we're just going to get rid of jury trials because it's too hard for the jury to, think of, to negotiate and sort through this stuff, and they're not an expert in everything. And why don't we just let the judge handle all the trials and what could go wrong? It's a little bit similar to that. Look, Congress has what we call collective action problems. It's 535 people trying to figure out how to agree. It's really hard what they do every day. And so the benefit of going through that difficult process is that we are supposed to get outcomes that are more representative for the whole country. And I think right now what we get are outcomes that are representative of whatever party is in power, or short of that, we just get the status quo. And I think people are really unhappy with that.
Yeah. Well, Michael, thank you so much for coming on the show, man. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Grant. It was great talking to you.
I want to thank Michael again for being on the show. You can find a link to the Bipartisan Policy Center and their brand new series, Congress at a Crossroads, in the show notes. And that's it for this episode. Please rate and review wherever you get your podcasts. Sign up for the Make It Make Sense Substack. And as always, share the show on social media. It's Mims News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word on every platform. I am at Granthermes on Twitter and Bluesky, and at Grant_Hermes on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Granthermes, and I'll talk to you next week.